Now at 6, local, state, and national leaders getting answers on lead-sheathed wiring laid down years ago that could pose a potential health hazard for cities and towns across the country and right here in Western Mass.
Western Mass News reporter Wesley Days has more details on what they found earlier this afternoon. And Wesley, this isn't the first time leaders like Senator Ed Markey have raised their concerns.
It is not, Abby and Chris. Interest in this dates back to last summer after a Wall Street Journal investigation found a lingering issue with these cables that could impact neighborhoods across the country. Now, the concern is if lead from those encased wires begins to deteriorate and chips they could pocket themselves into soil. It could also lead to contamination that could also hurt your water supply. Well, our Western Mass News cameras were rolling as tests took place in one area of Chicopee today, right above those lead-sheathed wires. This is what the experts found and what Senator Markey had to say.
There are some hot spots. This guideline, the US EPA guideline, is now 200 milligrams per kilogram, or what's called parts per million. We had numbers of 100, 200, but there are spots that are 600.
That 600 parts of lead per million is something that human beings should not be exposed to.
Now, on top of those concerns about the homes and the contaminations, there were also concerns about employee safety when it comes to handling these wires. We reached out to US Telecom, the organization that represents major companies that are responsible for those wires that are up there. They responded with a statement that says, in part, quote, "The US telecom industry prioritizes the health and safety of its communities and workers. We will continue to follow the science, which has not identified that lead-sheathed telecom cables are a leading cause of lead exposure or the cause of a public health issue. Our industry prioritizes worker safety, including providing training, personal protective equipment or other equipment, and a means to report safety-related incidents." Now, our line of questioning with Senator Markey shifted to the border and to the nation's capital, where the Senate is expected to vote sometime this week on a proposed package that aims to impose stricter limits on how many people can cross into the country per week and day. It's a bill that House Speaker Kevin Johnson said would be dead on arrival if it came over to his part of Congress. This is what Senator Markey had to say in response.
Obviously, a deal that would have been more satisfactory would have had a pathway to citizenship. Speaker Johnson is someone who has been calling for solutions to all of these problems throughout his tenure. And then when the Senate begins to act, he says that everything is dead on arrival rather than saying that he wants to work to find a way on a bipartisan basis to work on all these issues.
It's unclear when that vote will take place. Reporting live in studio, Wesley Days, Western Mass News.